who am I missing? California, Oregon, and Washington. See, Washington would kill me. Washington's my second home, and Washington would kill me. And Washington. Okay, so we had at the federal level, we had a few amendments to our Constitution in regards to discrimination. One was the Fifth Amendment that prohibited the US for treating their citizens unfairly. Okay. And the second one was the 13th, that was after the war, that prohibited slavery and treating African Americans as second-class citizens. We also had the 14th Amendment that also was kind of like both amendments combined. Listen, don't discriminate in regards to housing, treat everybody fairly, don't be bad, don't be bad, don't be bad. Okay, so this is after WW2. And so the state of California saw a lot of people come in from out of the war. And of course, they settled in San Francisco, right? San Francisco was settled. That's when California first became a state. A lot of the people after the war settled in San Francisco. And so the first case of housing discrimination was when a Black man and a white woman who were a married couple attempted to buy land up in San Francisco. And the developer said, no, we're not selling to you because your husband's Black. The husband sued, and that case is what sparked the entire conversation in regards to race discrimination and housing, okay? The gentleman argued that the developers cannot discriminate against me because I'm Black. Let's take this all the way to the Supreme Court. That was in 1965, and that case was called Jones versus Meyer. Jones ended up winning, obviously, which is why that kind of started everything. And the developer believed that he was treated unfairly, okay? So right after that, they said, we probably need to get something on the books in regards to fair housing because this is going to come up a lot. And so the government enacted the Fair Housing Act. Great. This is going to help make sure that folks like Jones who want to buy property do not get discriminated against again. Okay, so everything's fixed. Government came in, Fair Housing Act, fixed it. So Fair Housing Act said, listen, you can't discriminate against people for race, creed. You just can't do it. They need housing, give them housing. Let's not go back and forth. Let's give them housing, okay? And so everything was great. And so in post-war Richmond, California, lots of Black people said, all right, we'll settle in this area. We can buy houses now. And so they started settling, and people started realizing that a lot of soldiers coming back from the war were settling in Northern California. And so they said, wait, time's out. We don't want the Black soldiers and the white soldiers' families settling together here in California. We need something that's going to stop this integration. And so what they did was they said, listen, we need them to have housing, but we don't want them mingling together. And so they did a few housing projects, like public housing, and they essentially had Blacks in one barrack and whites in one barrack, kind of the way the war was. They were separated back then. And what they did was they restricted some of the activities of the area to whites only. And so Blacks could only go and use certain pools and certain things and mingle with other whites after 5 o'clock, or from 5 until 8. And so lots of these barracks are housing that the Blacks were, or should I say African Americans, because my skin, but some of the barracks that they were situated in were terrible. They were unkept, deteriorating, badly constructed. They were absolutely horrible. While the whites had beautiful barracks, sunshine and berries, and everything looked nice. But the Blacks, they were fine. The other thing is a lot of the barracks were by railroad tracks and in industrial areas. And the whites were by the ocean and, inland even. And it was just sunshine and berries and everything was great. And so the Blacks said, okay, we understand this, but we don't really like the segregation, but, we'll get what we can. And the developers at the time knew that there was a housing boom because everyone was coming out from the war. And so what the developers did was they needed money in order to build, more housing. And so what they did was they went to the FHA, which is the Federal Housing Administration, and said, we need money in order to build more housing for this huge population boom. And so give us money and back our loans so that we can also go to the banks for money and have them have our developments look stronger because FHA is backing them. And they said, okay, that's what they did. Afterwards, we had the Ford plant. Okay, Ford Motor Vehicles settled into Northern California, and they ended up hiring a bunch of people. It was great. Now there's jobs. So now we have housing and now there's jobs. But what the Ford plant did was they hired about 100,000 workers that were white and about 300 that were black. Okay, huge difference. They didn't want to hire any black folks. So here's strike two. So first they're slaves. Then when they go and fight, in a war for you, they come back, you give them horrible housing. And then when jobs come to the area, you only hire a small percentage and then you treat them unfairly. Insurance companies like Prudential and Equity Life decided that they didn't want to give life insurance policies to Black African American people. And so their policies ensured that any integrated areas, okay, so say we have Richmond, California, and it started to be integrated with Black and white people. They said, those areas, we will not issue life insurance policies for not only the Black people, but for the white people as well. So nobody gets a policy. If you're going to integrate, you're not going to get a policy from those two companies, okay? And so many of the white Americans were like, well, we can't have integration because we're not getting life insurance. The banks are going against us. The government's going against us. So why are we sitting here? We have to push back against the integration. And so they did. However, there were still lots of people looking for houses and there was a need for it. And so they ended up pushing Black folks into certain areas. And these areas back then started to be called ghettos, okay? Not my term, their terms. So they have these now ghettos where they place these Black people in. And a lot of these ghettos were public housing. And so they knew more than African Americans were going to apply to be in these housings. They knew that there were still lower class white Americans, not the middle class, but the lower class who were also needing of housing. So, okay, here we go, integrating again, right? Here we go with integration. We got the middle class Blacks and the poor whites now wanting public housing. So they said, now we have a problem because they're integrating again. So let's do this. Let's make it very hard for applicants to get into our public housing system. And so some of the things that they did was when they applied, they said any irregularities in employment, you're disqualified. If you're a single parent, you're disqualified. If you have an unkept home of where you currently live, you're disqualified. If you don't have furniture, you're disqualified. So all of these tactics were used once again to stop integration and to stop African Americans, and this is a middle class, from getting into public housing. Okay, so now where do they go? Now where do we all go? Then we had something called the New Deal. Anybody remember that? Old Roosevelt came out with the New Deal and that was gonna make everything better. The government keeps coming up with ways to make everything better when they see a problem. So they come out and say, listen, we're gonna do the New Deal, okay? And what that did, amongst other things, is what they opened public housing to not just those returning from the war, but to ordinary civilians. So anybody can do it because, there was a need for housing. And so once again, we have Blacks and whites integrating, they're trying to get together. And I'm going to read a quote after the New Deal by President Gerald Ford's, who was defending HUD. Here's what he argued. Let me read this. There will be an enormous practical impact on innocent communities who have to bear the burden of housing. There would be an enormous practical impact on innocent communities who have to bear the burden of housing. So, housing was a burden, projects were a burden, and they did not want these housing projects in certain areas because they felt that the single family residences who already lived there were going to burden them. You know, it's interesting because our National Association of Realtors came out a couple of months ago and gave a blanket apology for some of the tactics that they used in conjunction with our US government in order to keep people of color out of housing. And they apologized. You know, they said, listen, we know our role and what we did, and we want to apologize for this because there is a history of discrimination, and we played a part in that, which I think is great. Great. NAR coming out now, not really doing anything today, but they came out and said, we apologize, but with no action. Realtors, along with Republican representatives, were in conjunction with each other in order to discriminate against African Americans, Japanese Americans, Puerto Ricans in housing. Realtors were. They're in conjunction with. Okay. So one code of ethics verse that I read said that no realtor can show houses to any person of color. It is against the code of ethics. If a realtor showed houses to a person of color, that will upset the community in which they are showing in. So, for example, if you have a predominantly white or predominantly Latino neighborhood, you as a realtor would be in violation of the code of ethics for showing a non whatever community that is to that particular community. Like you couldn't show an African American a home in a predominantly Asian neighborhood. You couldn't do it. A lot of that was focused on African Americans and white, but it was all kind of together, right? It was just a blanket discrimination. Again, Americans wanting to integrate and the government stepping in and disallowing it after slavery. It sounds a lot like the Jim Crow laws that were in the Deep South were kind of implanted with everyone in the other states via these laws and rules and regulations. Does this sound familiar? It should. Could you imagine what it would be like today if they didn't have these segregation laws on the books? What our neighborhoods would look like? Could you imagine there not being a such thing as an African American neighborhood, a white neighborhood, a Latina neighborhood? A lot of the voices raise their hand and say, well, you know, blacks want to live with blacks and whites want to live with their own people. They want to live together because, you know, it's similar cultures. Is that really true though? Is that correct? I don't think that's correct. Of course, if there's similar cultures, I'm more comfortable. Am I more comfortable though? Me, and for instance, I'm not very comfortable with just one. I like a variety, so I don't know about you. Now, moving on. So we have the Jim Crow laws, and then I just gave you 5 examples of attempting of integration, and then 5 examples of the government stepping in and stopping it after slavery. And so no matter how much they kept doing it, it didn't work. And so they came up with a thing called zoning. You guys know what zoning is, right? Zoning is where you have a particular area and you say this area can only be used for this. Normally that happens with housing, single family residence, commercial, industrial homes. You don't want to mix the single family with commercial, industrial with single family, so forth and so on. Okay, so they came out with zoning laws. They said, we're not going to do it. Okay. And they said, great. Okay, single family could be with single family. But what happened is that a lot of African Americans could not afford loans, or they were denied loans. So they weren't able to get a single family residence. So what did they do? They got into apartments. And what the zoning law said was you cannot build apartments by single family residents. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound familiar? That is why we have zoning laws. Redondo Beach. I know Redondo Beach is kind of going back and forth with the issues with ADUs and zoning. But this is why we have those laws on the book, because it was to stop the integration. It all goes back to that. It all is going to continue to go back to that. So what happened after that? Well, the folks, the plantation owners who owned slaves at the time, in order to get around a lot of this stuff, what they did was they said, listen, these are not my slaves. These are sharecroppers, okay? So the term slaves essentially turned into the term sharecropper. And so the plantation owners they had sharecroppers that worked for them, that they still were able to treat badly and inhumanely, didn't feed them, didn't pay them enough. And so they got around the slavery laws by saying they're not my slaves, they're employees. Does that sound familiar? They're not my slaves, they're employees. They're not independent contractors, they're employees, right? So here we go again, United States getting around the rules and laws. Black people are starting to integrate. Mexicans are starting to integrate. So now what? So the next thing they did was the locals started taking the law into their own hands. And they ended up doing something called harassing African Americans if they were in their town after a certain hour. Here in the South Bay, we had a group of youngsters back in the 60s who were teenagers, and they would ride their bikes through Torrance and through Redondo and through PV, and they would harass African American people that they saw on the street after 5. I know some of you know the term for what I'm describing, and it's called sundown town. Remember that? Sundown. So before the sun goes down, and if you are an African American person or a Latino person or an Asian person, you need to be out of that area before the sun goes down. These young teenagers that rode their bikes on our dear old Sepulveda, they were called spook hunters. What they would do is they would police when the police didn't police. They rounded people up and they got them out of town. Legend has it that these sundown towns still exist. Palos Verdes, Torrance, anywhere south of PCH. So now we have zoning and sundown towns, everything we can do to stop people from integrating, right? Okay. So they said, these African Americans are still encroaching on white single family neighborhoods. So the zoning laws work. And what we'll do is this. For zoning, we will have the African Americans in these certain places, and we'll call them industrial. And what we'll do is we will allow liquor stores and gambling halls and prostitution houses. All of that can be found in your local industrial area, Gardena. and we will keep the people of color there. But there was also rules on the books that said these establishments could not be in any quote unquote white neighborhoods. So that's why you don't see a Hustler's Casino in Manhattan Beach. That's why you see it closer to the freeway in the city of Gardena. And so African Americans also live there, very industrial. And they also allowed businesses like our beautiful Torrance refinery to come in and set up in lower income neighborhoods. So they did everything that they could, okay, in order to make life unbearable for people of color just trying to survive post WW2 and post slavery, okay? Let me read the actual quote from the Realtor Code of Ethics, because I know a lot of realtors are listening today. Okay. So we know what our Code of Ethics says. If you go down on the board, they got it printed out in your face, letting you know, follow the code, follow the code. This was also one of the items on our Code of Ethics. Let me read verbatim. No realtor should be instrumental in introducing to any neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. It's a lot, honey. Okay. Let me read you a quote from the Commission of Racial Justice in the United States Church of Christ and Greenpeace. Race was a strong statistical producer of where hazardous waste facilities could and would be found. So race is a factor of where the hazardous waste facilities could be found. This is Greenpeace. This is Greenpeace. So they did what they can to continue to push African Americans out of housing, and at the federal level, they were essentially getting pressured in both ways. They had amendments on the books, but they weren't very enforceable. And so the locals once again said, we can't have them integrating. So what we'll do is we will create and we build, okay? I'm a developer and I'm gonna develop this small town. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create something on the deed that says you cannot sell to an African American person. So anytime that deed gets transferred over and over again, there's a little clause, a covenant that says you cannot sell this house at any point of time to an African American person. That created what we know now as to be your local HOA. It all has roots in racism, people. This didn't just come out of thin air. The HOAs were created in order to keep people of color out of homes. If you look on some of the covenants, the CC&Rs of your local HOA, if you live in an HOA, take a look at the deed. It's like, the CC&Rs are like 100+ pages, right? Have you ever stopped and read that? I saw somebody online the other day who actually stopped and read her deed and said, my deed actually says I cannot sell my house, buried down deep in there, cannot sell my house to an African American person. What can I do? Is it enforceable? And of course, it's not enforceable today, but she discovered she was one of them. It was part of her deed in her HOA. And the interesting thing about it is that nobody looked to get that taken off of, it's absolutely amazing. So then they tried again. This time, the National Association of Realtors said, okay, let's come up with this plan. What we're going to do is have real estate agents go in to certain areas, certain white areas, mind you, and we're going to hire a bunch of African-American folks. And these African-American folks are going to do these certain things. Okay. So they hired single women, and they had them push baby carriages down the esplanade or whatever. They hired African-American teens to ride their cars through prominent white areas, playing loud music. They hired African-American men to go and knock on doors, asking if their houses were for sale. They're thinking about selling. They hired more African-Americans to call different whites in different areas, asking if so-and-so was there, using a quote, this is their quote, African-American voice, whatever that means. And so these are realtors who did this, okay? They hired these African-Americans to do so. And so what happened was what they call white panic. White homeowners started calling the realtors and say, I need to sell my house. They're integrating. And so the realtor said, well, let me come list your house. And so they did so. The whites were so panicky that they would list their house and sell it for very, very cheap. Now, this happened in California. This was California. The whites were selling their houses for very cheap because these realtors decided to put up billboards all over the place, hinting that people of color might be moving into their neighborhood. And so they sold their house for cheap and they moved inland. And then they turned around and sell it to African Americans. So then African Americans were moving into the neighborhood. But remember, African Americans couldn't get a typical mortgage. Remember, that wasn't fixed. Bank of America was one of the big banks that did not lend to African Americans. FHA would not insure their loans. So what did the realtors do? They put African Americans on what's called like a payment plan. Okay, you're going to pay us. And what they did, they had strict terms. One of the terms were, if you miss one payment, and if you are late on one payment, you are hereby evicted out of your home that you were paying for. And of course, with low wages, African Americans were often evicted. And so realtors were able to sell that house once, twice, 3 times over, and they did it in masses, National Association of Realtors. You guys are just... That's called blockbusting, by the way. They also did redlining. I mean, everybody knows about redlining. Same thing. Realtors, again, they would refuse the loan because the area was poor and they thought the loan was risky. So there we are again, locked out of housing, locked out of housing, locked out of housing. In downtown LA, Blacks and whites were integrating. And so the developers went to the local government and said, all right, the population has moved from Northern California into Southern California. Look, we're getting closer to the South Bay. And so we need rail systems and freeways in order to get whites down to the business districts. And the government agreed and they gave them money. And so they built what we call our 110 freeway. They built the freeway, essentially getting whites down to busy financial districts in downtown LA. Then they also built the Santa Monica freeway. If you remember, a lot of African-American people settled in View Park, Baldwin Hills, those sort of places, okay? So they had homes there. And when they decided to build the Santa Monica freeway, guess what they did to the Blacks in their homes? You can only imagine. There was a Black middle class that lived all along the Santa Monica freeway, and it devastated them. They took their houses to build that freeway. So that middle class became lower class, and that lower class had to move into apartments and further away inland. And so our freeway system is a big, huge reason why we have integration. It's why we have a South Bay bubble. It's why things are the way they are. So this occurred in the South, right? This isn't here. This isn't here. Like I mentioned before, and as I was introduced, my family has roots in the South and the South Bay. And my mother was, she was born in Mississippi. Okay. My mother was in mortgage lending when I was a young girl. I would go in to work with her on Saturdays, and she would work for the banks. And she worked with Fannie and Freddie, and she was their top, she was the top. She was everything. But she grew up poor in the Mississippi Delta. Now, I'm going to share with you a little bit of history. I want you to pay very close attention to this story. I'm going to play it for you. Pay very close attention to what I'm going to show you. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why these things matter. Because not everybody see my screen. Hopefully you can.
Yes.
Let's pause that. All right. Hi, this is Katrina Matthews, and as promised, I have my mother here, Ruby Bailey, and we will that occurred in the South as she grew up, and then also what occurred when she finally moved to Southern California here in our South Bay. So, Ruby, thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. Great, great. Well, I grew up in a little small town called Morehead, Mississippi, which is considered the Delta of Mississippi. My mother had 14 children. I am the second of 14 children. Oh, wow. So, one of the biggest stories in the civil rights movement in regards to Emmett Till, can you explain a little bit about how we're connected to that family? Emmett Till was my mother's nephew. That was her brother's son. He was in Chicago with his mother. He came to Mississippi to visit his grandmother. He went to the store, and it is alleged that he whistled at a white lady. She went back and told the town people, and they went and drug him out of his home, out of the bed. He was 14 years old, and they murdered him. These gangster of white people went to my family home in Lexington, Mississippi, and they was going to kill up all of Emmett Till's family. So they scrambled, got their things together, and migrated from Mississippi to Iowa. Emmett Till's father, we don't know what happened to him. From my understanding, the last they saw of him, he was on the back of a truck. They have no idea what ever happened to Emmett Till's father. A lady at a store, and that is what she supposedly reported, and that eventually led to his ultimate murder, which is he just like flat out and lied. Because from my family, she stated that he whistled at her. Yeah. Although she did recant her story years later before she died, that he did not whistle at her. He did nothing to her. Wow. Wow. So her lie caused his death. Right. My mother went to Des Moines, Iowa. Other family members went to Waterloo, Iowa. So that's where they migrated to Iowa. And to this day, the family still resides in Iowa. In 2018, I had the opportunity to meet the family on my mother's side when I attended a family reunion. That's wonderful. And it was amazing to meet them and listen to them tell the story, how they had to flee for their lives because of a lie of a white woman. So tell me a little bit about your father's involvement with the, so I understand that our grandfather is actually still alive, and he was one of the first law enforcement in the local area? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, my father is 107 years old. He's alive today. He drives.
Wow.
Gets around. My father was the first African American to be elected to be a police officer in the small town of Morehead, Mississippi.
And I think you was explaining to me a little bit about, as a police officer, an African American one, he was instructed not to accost or question or arrest any person that was of white descent. Does that?
Yes, he was told he could not arrest any white person. He replied by telling him, if you do wrong, I'm going to arrest you, no matter what color you are.
Eventually, you moved away from the Delta South and you moved to Southern California, right here in the South Bay, right?
Yes, I did.
Settled in the South Bay, isn't that
Yes.
great?
Yes.
We're going to fast forward a little bit and talk a little bit about what happened the day that you got the phone call regarding your son, which is my brother. Can you tell me just a little bit about what that was like and what happened back then? He was a young African American kid, right?
Yes. It was a Sunday night. I was in bed and I received a phone call from a friend. Said that Ken, because my son's name is Kenneth, we call him Ken, had been shot. Before I could finish dressing, my sister-in-law called to tell me to report that he had been shot, and she was on her way to Harvard with him. And before I could get out my door, she called me back and said that he didn't make it, he died.
So that's sort of like what occurred back in the South, right?
Same like Emmett Till. Emmett Till was killed because of color of skin.
Well, thank you for telling your story. It's not an easy thing, and to have to deal with having a child murdered just because of his skin color is something that a lot of people can't fathom. And here you are, kind of lived this thing twice.
Yes.
In life over race, and you're also a resident here in Southern California and have been a long-time resident of the South Bay. Okay, so if you did not get the connection, Emmett Till, hold on 1 second. Emmett Till died because of the color of his skin. My brother also passed because of the color of his skin. Those that think that this only occurs in the South and does not occur in the South Bay they've got their heads buried in the sand. Can you imagine a situation where two distant cousins die in the same manner for the same reason at a different time in American history in two different parts of America? The coincidence the statistics on that must be who knows, but it happened. This is a we situation. When I say we, I'm talking about Latinos, I'm talking about whites, African Americans, Indians, Asians, Persians, Muslims, Jews. If you live in this country and you respect our flag, respect the amendments, respect the Constitution that our forefathers have enacted, then it is up to you. It really is. It's up to you to defend our flag from all enemies, foreign and domestic. So I leave you today with the story of issues of discrimination. You've learned how the US government, HUD, FHA, and others had continuously stopped African Americans from housing, from food, from employment, and they continue to do so today. The system is rigged in the favor of the favorites. And if you do not believe that this is occurring in your own backyard, look at some of the bills that have come onto our ballots. Look at some of the people who were running for office in our neighborhoods. Look at some of the things that they say and the things that they do, and start to question whether or not this is racism that is embedded in our DNA, because it is. So now you've learned all the ways that we as people have tried to come together and all the ways our government has pushed us apart. It is up to you to choose candidates who have your favor and your children's favor and your children's favor at heart. I want to thank you guys for coming in and enjoying this wild ride of American history with me. Now that you know your history, do something about your future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katrina. And on that note, on that call to action, I'm going to drop in two local organizations that you can be a part of. One of them is Neighbors Not Nuisance, whose goal is to encourage community members through self-compassion to extend grace and resources and actions to their marginalized neighbors. And the other one is the Mellon Family Generational Wealth Foundation. And this is a foundation that I support personally, but it strives to increase generational wealth in low to moderate income African-American families. As Kat spoke about, there were several ways that our history, our governments, the people in power, the white Americans in power power opportunities to own houses by African-American families. And then when they did own them, stole them back by having poor loan structures, using eminent domain to literally steal their houses to build freeways. So the Mellon Family Generational Wealth Foundation actually offers grant payments of up to $20,000 to enable home ownership. So those are two organizations that you can support locally, and I've dropped their information into the chat box. Kat, so there's a few questions that came in, and then I just want to encourage anybody else to drop your questions into the Q&A box. But I was wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit more about the role of guns and in how in different neighborhoods across the US that are divided by color, how guns play a different role and what guns mean in some communities, and how they're used to continue to support segregation.
So guns were used just like drugs were used in the Black communities, okay? So they made it very easy for African Americans to get guns on the streets. And they said, here's drugs, here's guns, and we're not going to enforce any kind of police activity in these certain areas. And we'll just let them figure them themselves out. And so that's what they did. It wasn't until white Americans had guns and gun violence began to get out of control. Okay. There is a portion in our South Bay area called Harbor City, and Harbor City had gangs, and it actually still does. Over 10, 15 years ago, what's now known as Harbor Village was actually called Normont Terrace, and that was our local South Bay housing projects. Okay, and so in this housing projects, they had drugs and guns, and LAPD was the responding department for that area. However, they only responded if they needed to, right? And so drugs and guns ran rapid in that small community. But it wasn't until gun violence spilled over into the city of Torrance and into the city of Palos Verdes and so forth, to where they started looking at gun control. Okay. My mom was one of the people who championed for California legislation for gun control. And I'm going to actually drop into the YouTube that full video, because she goes deep down into that and she explains what happened when she championed for gun control after my brother was killed. And so one of the things that she did was she would have to go from South Bay to Sacramento. And at that time, she was threatened by the NRA. They had to give her a police escort from LA, to and from LAX, because the NRA thought that my mom was champion for taking guns away. That is not 100% what she's about. She actually believes that you should be able to own guns. However, the legislation that they wanted to enact at the time that my brother was killed were for safety locks. We wanted safety locks on guns, and we wanted background checks. And so they did get that passed by Governor Gray Davis, but he experienced an amount, just enormous pressure. They called him the gun governor, and he faced a recall election over this whole thing. So it wasn't until that happened that the NRA was really kind of looking at California and their new gun policies, because California was going to set the history to what happens with other states in gun control.
Thank you, Katrina. There was another comment about trying to change in your HOA laws, how to get those changed, and that the feedback has been that it's a costly process, and so HOAs just leave them. And so what would be your recommendation for somebody who has, discriminatory, I don't know, I guess they're clauses in their HOA? And is it something that, a petition to the NAR can change? Like, who has the power to change that? And is it something that people should put their action towards?
It's very simple. If I am a resident and I owned a unit that has an HOA that has a clause in their CC&Rs that restricts people of color from buying, you know what I would do? I would sue the HOA. Take it to court, let them have to dish out their reserves in order to fight a lawsuit. And I bet you they'll change it before your court date. Sue them.
Thank you. And I there was the final question, and if anybody else has any other questions, please. Audrey says it's the CCR is not the HOA. Okay, so that's me. I don't have either of those things, so that was my confusion.
Yeah, the CC&Rs come from the HOA. Okay, so the HOA. I'm going to give you a perfect example of why I know that it can be changed, and it's not the CC&Rs, it's the HOA. First of all, the CC&Rs, the HOA governs that. I had a buyer who was buying in the city of Redondo Beach 2 years ago, before we were in a seller's market. Okay, two buyers. And we were purchasing a property in Redondo Beach. And before my buyer would go forth with the offer, they asked the listing agent, or we did, and asked if my buyer, if they purchase it, will they be able to rent out their Redondo Beach condo? Because sometimes my buyers can work remotely. And so, and they also live internationally. Okay. And they said, well, let's see, because in the CCNR, there is a clause that says that you cannot rent out your unit. You have to be owner occupied right there in the CCNRs. So I asked the listing agent, hey, you know, we would love to go forward with an offer. However, your CCNRs say that we can't rent our unit out, and my guys need to be able to do that if possible. Do you know the listing agents went to the HOA, called an emergency meeting to change the CCNRs to get my buyer to purchase that property? So it can be done. Emergency meetings to change a clause in regards to renting it out? Really? If they can do that.
So it's the amount of pressure that we put on them.
Yeah, come on now. Come on now.
The other question that came through was, could you talk a little bit about how eminent domain works, and how when we were building freeways, you know, specifically in California, but all across the United States, were families compensated? What did the legal structure look like? Was it just like who was going in and evicting people? And what did that process look like? And then was there any compensation?
Yeah, so that is actually happening right now in our South Bay city of Inglewood. Okay, so I like to give real world examples because that's the only way we can learn. So, you know, we have our new SoFi Stadium, right? Where the Rams are losing. I mean, not just kidding, they're doing great. Where the Rams are playing. I'm a Packer fan. Like, what do you want? We have our new stadium and the Rams are doing great. You know, they made it all the way. And how did they get to build that stadium? Because there was a bunch of people who own a lot of places there. Same thing with LAX. LAX, remember when they wanted to expand 10 something years ago? More than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, LAX wanted to expand, do their expansion. Okay, this is all private companies, right? Private companies. They went and they lobbied the government and said, we need to expand LAX, or we need to build a stadium, you know, Inglewood. But we've got these properties in the way. And so what they did was they went and they offered the homeowners fair market value for their properties, okay, and hired relocation companies to move them out. Okay, back then they didn't do that. They only offered them fair market value according to their appraisers, who were all racist. And so you really didn't get fair market value. You got what they thought you should get and called it a day. And so that's what they did. And they moved those people out in order to build freeways, you know, LAX, stadiums. That's the tactic they use. Unfortunately, the problem was that there was a huge percentage of people who weren't able to get back in housing. And that's a big problem that is happening today at the stadium, is that they're taking their houses and they're offering what they think is fair and they're forcing them out. But then those people now become buyers. And currently right now there's a seller's market. So instead of them becoming buyers / homeowners, they now become renters. And then that money is gone within a few years. And now they're permanent renters. And now they're starting the cycle all over again. And so they do not have equity in the home that they've owned for years that they can pass down to their generations, which helps with things like college tuition and so forth and so on, and educating our youth. And so this cycle continues.
And on that same note, the recent election that we had last year, there was some amendments that were related to real estate and related to being able to pass down your home and the taxes around that. Can you talk about any recent legislation and how how the legacy of systemic racism, how racism still shows up in stuff that's in amendments that are in our election ballots today, more recently?
So they had a couple of them come down, a couple of propositions in which they wanted to make it easier for homeowners to pass down their properties to their children and not pay hefty tax fines, okay? Because when you transfer property, you have to pay the taxes on it. And so in order to make that easier, they said, we'll give you a tax break if you pass it down, which was great. But what the recent propositions did was they said, okay, you can pass it down to your children. However, your children have to own or occupy the property. They cannot rent it out. Okay. So what that did, a lot of people were up in arms about that because they said, wait a minute, they have to live in it. They can't rent it out. Well, that's not fair. And what those homeowners started to do was, well, maybe we should probably sell our property. And I think that was the backwards way of the government forcing more housing to be on the market because there's a housing shortage. So if I can't pass it down to my child who wants to rent it out, maybe my child went to school in Boston and stayed in Boston. And so if they're not renting it out, then what do I do? They have to, so then maybe I should sell it because she's not moving back here. And so that was a backwards way of the government attempting to get more housing on the market. I do know a lot, there's a certain kind of people that like that law. There was a certain kind of people that didn't like that law. I was on the fence with it. I understand being able to pass down property, but we are also in a housing crunch. And I also don't want to force people to have to sell their property or homeowners. But I think it doesn't matter. I think what matters is understanding that people of color did not get the advantage of the passing down of the property. So I believe the government is trying to rectify that and do the right thing, but the propositions, in my opinion, are still written poorly, which is why a lot of them don't pass. They're just poorly written. And so if they get a couple of good minds together and don't participate in groupthink, these propositions can work. But the way they look now in 2021, I think they're still junk.
One other question, if you have time. Thank you all for staying on. Oh, my screen. So Redondo is dominated by slow growth proponents that push a racist housing agenda. So no affordable housing. You spoke a little bit about zoning and how zoning is a code word for keeping specific community members out and using density as the reason for that. Do you know whether the majority of real estate professionals in the area support that agenda? What is your feeling, I guess, with your peers?
So that whole question is so coded, and I know I can rewrite through it. I know exactly what they're talking about. Amongst my peers, I see a little bit of both. And you know what? It's funny because the folks that are not afraid of density and all this other stuff, they don't speak up. I think that's the issue. They're not as vocal as the ones that are afraid of density. Redondo Beach has been as a city, has not seen the sort of growth that they should have seen years ago. A lot of my clients are international clients who have relocated from different areas in the United States and from overseas because they work for some of the big names that have landed here like Tesla and SpaceX, right? So we got a lot of those international people now here who are first time in our beautiful beach cities. And the question I get so often is, why does Redondo Beach look like a sad old place? They have a lot of places, a lot of stock or inventory as far as commercial buildings. that are not being utilized or underutilized. They have a lot of empty storefronts. The Redondo Beach Pier has just been eroded to death. There's a where the police command station is at the Redondo Beach Pier. That remains empty. It's been empty for over a decade. It needs fixing. It needs money coming in. Artesia Boulevard it's seen a little bit of growth, but not the sort of growth that it should have seen, being a beach city. And I think the fear of Redondo Beach residents is not necessarily density. I believe that they want developers to come in and redevelop the area, but the problem is it's politics, isn't it always? There's certain politicians who do not want anything in Redondo Beach to change, but you have to remember when we have new developments in the city of Redondo Beach, that brings property values up. I hear all the time that they don't want Redondo Beach looking like Huntington Beach. It's never going to be, it's going to always be Redondo Beach. I hear that all the time. And so I think Redondo Beach is stuck in a time warp, and I would definitely love to see change. And I think I will in my lifetime. I think it'll change. But to answer the question, yes, I do see real estate professionals who do want the change, but the problem is they're not vocal for fear that their colleagues will give them that look. But they do call me and tell me. They call and tell me. They tell me they're for it. I don't speak up.
Thank you so much, Katrina. I think you've twice now basically called us into action. So if there's anything else you'd like to say, as we wrap up, I'd love to pass the floor over to you for some closing words. And I'm deeply grateful for you joining us this evening.
I just want to thank you guys as well for reaching out to me in order to do this. I think the lesson in history is very important. I love reading and watching history. And this one in regards to housing, it hits home more than you know. There's a lot of stuff that unfortunately I believe that you guys aren't prepared to hear. I mean, you're just not. You're just not. I always go back, and it's so funny because this reference is ridiculous, but I think it works. If you've ever watched this movie with Leonardo DiCaprio called The Beach, has anybody ever watched that movie? It's such a good movie. It's when he was at his prime. He was running around on the beach, being off free. And so this movie it's about is American who goes to this Thai secluded beach that he finds in like the middle of nowhere. And these people from all over the world, Australia, Africa, England, they all go and they hear about the legend of this beach. And they go in and they find themselves there, and they create their own little community. And so, of course, when humans start creating communities, they always begin to do a hierarchy because that's what we do. And so they have like this queen who reigns over the beach, and she tells people what to do and their tasks and their jobs. And everybody loves it. They do their job, and then the rest of the day they play volleyball on the beach. It's great. And so there's an incident that occurs that upsets their heaven, and it's where these guys go into the water and they get bitten by a shark. And so they don't have healthcare on this beach. They don't have doctors on this beach. And so it's like, what do we do as a community? And so they bring the guys in who were bitten by the shark. And unfortunately, two pass away almost immediately. And the third guy, he's got a leg that's mangled and he's suffering. And the entire community is like, what do we do? What do we do? Oh my God, he's suffering. And so in the middle of the night, they would hear this guy cry out in pain. Oh, oh, oh. And they would hear this and they would run to him. But after a couple of days, he would be crying out and less people came to aid him until there was just one person on the beach. Every time this gentleman would cry out, would go to this aid. And so the community had decided, listen, we can't take this anymore. And so they take this poor injured man and they pull him into the forest essentially to let him die. And the very next day, they go back to playing volleyball and things are great. And the one person who went out and sat with this man until he died comes out and he's like, he's finally gone. Oh my God, I feel so horrible. And then he goes back to the community and says, how dare you abandon him? Are you not human? And they surmise that the community as a whole could not sleep at night hearing this man's cry for help. And so they rather shut their eyes and put him away than to help this man, than to get him aid, than to take him to a doctor. They could have did all these things, or to bring somebody in. They rather shut their eyes and play volleyball, Hermosa Beach. And so the one guy comes back and he's disgusted with this. He said, I don't want to be a part of this community if this is how we're going to treat each other. And they all end up leaving the beach. And I mean, that was actually the fall of their society, was the non-helping of this man. Okay, that is going to happen right here. If we continue to close our eyes and look the other way and play volleyball while we hear the cries of our neighbors, our friends, our co-workers, our essential workers, that will be the fall of our community. Because if one doesn't work, if one fails, we all fall, honey. And I'll leave you guys with that.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Thank you everyone for joining us. I also popped in Katrina's YouTube channel so you can rewatch the video, and then she'll also add the video she was talking about. So thank you so much, Katrina, for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Take care.